Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about A Crime on the Bayou in this discussion, which is a presentation of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. This is a documentary about some brave individuals in the struggle for equality and dignity during the Civil Rights era. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. Our center, in its work and its exhibitions, connects civil rights history to the ongoing struggle for human rights around the world today. And I'm delighted to be your moderator. We're gonna be discussing this film in a moment of reckoning on race in our country. And we see in this documentary one of the periods of state-sponsored racism against African Americans that sheds light on where we are today. And it reminds us of the historical through line of police abuse, of disproportionate incarceration of Black people that we see today. And it also reminds us of the importance and the effectiveness of alliances, of people working together across differences. Finally, it reminds us that white supremacy is a long-standing problem in our country with some deep, deep roots. So I'll be talking about this and more with our two panelists. I am pleased to introduce Nancy Bursky. She is the director, producer, and writer of A Crime on the Bayou, which is part of a trilogy of civil rights films about human rights defenders that includes The Loving Story and The Rape of Recy Taylor. Nancy has a range of other films to her credit, and she's been nominated for a range of prestigious prizes and won some of them too. We also have Lolis Ellie. He is a writer and filmmaker as well. He's a former columnist for the Times-Picayune. His television credits include Bosch, The Man in the High Castle, Greenleaf, and the HBO series Treme. He also is an author of books on barbecuing, and he contributes to a range of publications from Gourmet Magazine to the New York Times. He brings all of that experience to our conversation, as well as something more intimate. He is the son of human rights lawyer Lolis Ellie, who is an undaunted civil rights pioneer whose work as a lawyer and organizer helped propel racial desegregation in New Orleans. The elder Lolis is a protagonist in this film. Gary Duncan's lawyer, as you know, Richard Sobel, worked at the firm, and he was a key witness in the prosecution of Sobel about the ban on having out-of-state lawyers represent civil rights defenders. So, welcome to you both. Nancy, I'll start with you. Where did you find this story? How did you come across it?
I was given a proposal for a book that was being written on this story and the broader picture of civil rights in Louisiana in the 60s. It's a book that has since been published and come out. It's called Deep Delta Justice by Matt Van Meter. And it just grabbed me. Although I have to say that when I initially was handed the proposal, I thought, well, I really have dealt with these issues in prior films, such as The Loving Story that you mentioned and The Rape of Recy Taylor. And I was a little bit concerned about going back to that again to see whether or not I could bring anything new and important to a project like this. And I realized that there was something bigger than the sum of its parts. If I did return to the subject matter, and this story by definition puts more emphasis on the legal struggles that went on then. It highlights a very specific white supremacist, Leander Perez. And it also highlights, as you mentioned, alliances that we had not really been able to explore as fully in the other movies. So I felt like this film could help us bring all the themes that we dealt with in the other films together and change the emphasis a little bit, and in fact give us a trilogy, which wasn't my initial intention, but that's what happened. And so I kind of moved forward on that. It was an exciting idea to move forward on something that we'd already been touching on before.
And was what's going on in the world today in your mind? I mean, do you consciously make that association?
Oh, yes. I mean, all of these films had tremendous relevance. With The Loving Story, we were looking at an African-American, a mixed race man running for the presidency, and this is Obama, beginning his campaign. There was efforts to move forward same-sex marriage in California, Proposition 8. So they seem very relevant topics for us. Then in the rape of Recy Taylor, we moved forward on that film mostly because we were shocked by the staggering number of rapes that had taken place in the 60s. But as the film was coming out, the Me Too movement was also beginning to surface. So it was kind of stars aligning. We were able to connect what had happened to Recy Taylor with a movement that everybody was, deeply involved in, and also make the point that Me Too started well before white women in Hollywood were complaining about harassment, that it had been going on for such a long time with African American women in the Deep South.
Yeah, I mean, as the director of a history museum, it's a point we find ourselves constantly making, is that this moment is connected to the one before and the one before and the one before, that you can't take it out of context.
I like to think of all these films not as history as much as reality we consider.
Yeah, good one. Lolis, welcome. So nice to meet you. When I was watching the film, I was always waiting for you to come back and speak, because I felt like you were so clear-eyed. There was a true north quality to what you were talking about. But I want to just go back for a minute. I'm very curious, growing up in your household and your dinner table conversations, did you understand what your father was doing?
Well, at the time of this case, I was very young. I was not at all aware of what he was doing then. The first of my father's work that I consciously remember is in 1970, when he was defending the Black Panther Party with his partner Ernest Jones, and also Dick Sobel, I believe, was part of that case as well. You have to understand something else, though. My sister and I integrated a private school in New Orleans, Trinity Episcopal School. And my parents made a point of reminding us that we were not to view ourselves as somehow different from all the other Black people who were not at this school. We were to see ourselves very much a part of a Black community. It's an exaggeration, but not an inaccuracy, to say that both of my parents were the first of their families to go to college. My mother was an educator, and so she was the main one trying to instill in us how we should approach our experiences in this institution, and how that also had political implications. So I remember being almost the only person in my elementary school to be supporting George McGovern in that race, to give you some sense of the climate.
Yeah, right. But you learn in the film that your dad's office was bombed. So there was a threat. There was real danger. Did that trickle to you?
The story that I remember in terms of danger facing my father and his law partners is one that Robert Collins tells in the film, about driving back from Mississippi and not calling the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which was an organization that vowed to shoot back if the Klan was going to shoot. Additionally, Robert tells the story of James Farmer coming back to New Orleans in a hearse, because there was such violence in Plaquemines that there was danger that he would be lynched there. And I grew up hearing the story that James Foreman slept in my sister's bed and bloodied the room because he had been beaten to some extent. But mind you, I was too young to really register those things. I was always interested in my father's work as I got older and had a better understanding of it, but I cannot speak firsthand about these events. In fact, the things that I learned because of Nancy.
Interesting. Nancy, it struck me during the movie that we don't get to see Gary and Richard Sobel together.
Till the end.
Till the end. How did you work that? What was the decision making?
Well, first of all, they were not in the same place. I mean, Richard Sobel was living in Sebastopol, California, and Gary Duncan was living outside of New Orleans, in Jefferson County, I believe. And so, I was lucky to get the interviews that I got. Gary is always happy to talk, not happy, but he is graciously generous about his need to talk about it. Richard was also very generous at the time, but it took him a while to get committed to the film. To be honest with you, he had told the story to the author of the book, and I think I'm not sure he even understood how important it was what he accomplished, and I think he was being modest. So it did take a little arm twisting to get him to agree. And then when we finally got them together, that was totally organic. We did not set it up. Gary was going to visit Richard, and I said, "All right, can we come? Can we be part of it?" And they said yes. By then, they had both gotten accustomed to the whole process of making the film, so they were incredibly cooperative. And I must say that I was very gratified to be able to show Richard Sobel the film before he passed away, which was in March. And it meant the world to all of us. And Gary was at that screening. We were in California. The author of the book joined us. So it was a very meaningful day for all of us.
Yeah, this is for both of you. In some ways, a lot of the lawyers of the movement, and we see this in our museum, the movement is Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and a lot of the other characters take a backseat role. And in some ways, these are some of the hidden figures, in a way, to use this contemporary term. Lolis, did you have that sense as your father's life, as he was in his later years, that he was a hidden figure who was unrecognized, or did you feel like people understood the role he played?
What I hear, even now, walking around, "Oh, your name is Lolis," you're like, "Oh, I knew your father. He was such a great man." I've learned not to ask a follow-up question to that statement, because people have a vague sense that he did things and important things, but don't have a real sense of what it was. Part of that is sort of the American lack of knowledge about history. And part of it is the fact that it was my father's job not to necessarily be in the forefront in terms of the action of what was going on. But I'm thankful to Nancy for having re-engaged me in these things, and even having me examine documents that I hadn't looked at as closely. And one of the things that was most striking to me, that I think is relevant to Richard Sobel in this regard, is often my father and I would be somewhere, and someone whom I'd heard was an important civil rights lawyer in New Orleans might greet us at a restaurant or out in public. My father, more often than not, had a disdain for these people. Well, in the deposition that's alluded to in the film, it's actually read in the film, my father's basically asked, were there not enough Black lawyers in Louisiana to obviate the need to bring all of these out-of-town agitators to work in these causes? My father said, in essence, was that first, there are few Black lawyers, and second, most of them don't want to have anything to do with this work. And therefore, it is all on me and my two partners and whatever other assistance we can gather. And so in that sense, I got a better notion of the heroism of Collins, Douglas, and Eli. And Nils Douglas is mentioned often in the film and cannot be mentioned enough. And Bob Collins as well was my father's other partner at that time.
Yeah, it strikes me that there are so many of these brave people whose stories are unheralded. We're learning about them more and more, women in the space program and these other figures who played a huge role. Nancy, you've really devoted a lot of time to telling these stories.
That's definitely a through line to these three stories. In each case, Mildred Loving and her husband, but especially Mildred, because she's the one that really triggered the action in that film. Recy Taylor, who was not known at all, literally buried from history. And then Gary Duncan and Richard Sobel. None of them were particularly well known, and we like to make the fact that history is made up of people like that who don't set out to change it and are not activists, but because they stand up for what is right and what is fair, they inevitably do change history. And I feel good about devoting a lot of time to those stories. I think these people should be lifted up, and nothing wrong with telling the other stories of people who are better known. But, obviously it takes a lot more than the Rosa Parks and the Martin Luther King Jr. to change history. It takes these people on the ground. In the rape of Recy Taylor, We used to talk about all the African American women who marched during the Montgomery bus boycott. Those are the boots on the ground. Those are the people that really made a difference. And we see that today because so many of these, particularly African American women, can make a difference in who gets elected. You know, those votes really, really count. So I think that we have an important story to tell and a reminder to so many people in the community at large that anybody can change history.
Yeah, so speaking of that, Richard Sobel is a great figure in this, and the distinction is made about those lawyers who stayed. So there's this 3-week program, they could come down, and then some stayed, and he stayed. And it seems like those who stayed were a special breed. They said they took it into their heart, this work. What was it about him that motivated him to do it?
You know, what is it about anybody who is passionate enough to get behind a cause and they can't let go? You know, it has a grip on them, and then they have a grip on others. And, you know, they're few and far between, but there are people who simply devote their lives to something that's right. And I think Richard Sobel was one of those. Now, he does reference at one point a connection to many of the lawyers who came to that during that period who were Jewish, and that there was a connection to their feelings about the Holocaust. But honestly, I don't think that that's what motivated Richard Sobel. I mean, he was Jewish and he did feel strongly about that. But I think that it really was Gary's story and his work with Collins, Douglas, and Eli. I think that the mentorship that he received in that firm was life-changing for him. And from then on, until he started traveling and going to other places, whether or not he was still working for the firm directly, he felt very connected to all three of those lawyers, but particularly to Lolis Eli Sr. I think that they formed a very powerful friendship and relationship, and it was life-changing for him.
Yeah. Do you have, Lolis, any insight into Richard Sobel?
Well, what I'd say is that a principle don't mean nothing until it costs you something. And so in the film, Richard talks about leaving this fancy law firm in New York and coming to New Orleans. And mind you, to do that during your vacation is relatively inexpensive. You're being paid still and you're going back to your job. To make the decision to continue this work means that the work is more important to you than the kind of things most of us think about in terms of career and financial success, et cetera, et cetera. There's another thing that was very, very important about Richard that cannot be overstated in the current context of reevaluation of how much Black Lives Matter. Richard Sobel had to come there despite his great training and his great experience and his great exposure to some of the best legal minds in the country. He had to come there and humble himself to 3 Black lawyers who certainly knew more about this situation than he did, but who also became, in some sense, his mentors. And part of the problem, part of the rift in the civil rights movement came about because white people from the North thought that they were going to come to the South, use these Black children, the 40 and 50 and 60-year-old children, to teach the racist white people of the South a lesson. What those people failed to understand, that Richard Sobel did understand, is that these people coming from the North with those kinds of attitudes were themselves racist, but in a more benign way. And therefore they could look in the mirror and think themselves not a part of the problem. When in fact, as efforts to desegregate northern cities proved, they were very much part and parcel of the problem.
Yeah. So the resonance to today, that these events happened and they are the historical antecedents to the moment that we're in, and we're in a moment of extreme backlash where white supremacy, which has always been around, has been given official permission to rear its head. We are in such a moment. And I think there are people who look back on the past and say, well, if I were alive then, I'd do X and Y, and it's interesting because now we are in a moment, and what are people doing? So what do you make of these parallels between then and now? Nancy, start with you.
Oh my God, that's such a big question and it's so complex. And I think we're just finding out, frankly. I think that there's still a lot that's evolving. I think that one of the things that is being looked at carefully is allyship. The alliances that were formed during the 60s and now the alliances that are being formed here. Someone said to me recently that whites should have so much responsibility due to our complicity and all of that, that when we're marching, you know, there's a question of should whites march with blacks. Someone even said it's only whites who should be marching because they're the ones who have to change things. And that just shocked me in a way. And I realized it's not up to blacks to change the world. It really is up to whites. We're the ones who started this. We're the ones who enslaved people. We're the ones that need to, you know, reset in a huge way. So I think that, you know, this film lays the foundation, lays the groundwork for a lot of these major questions. And they're really coming, you know, to a head right now. I don't know what's going to happen once, you know, we get rid of our particular commander and, you know, president in chief. I assume that some of it will come down, but not all of it. I think that we've gotten things, you know, so excuse the word, trumped up that, you know, it's going to be a while before we reckon with what's going on. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this is exactly the reset that we need.
Yeah, Lolis?
Yeah, the two of you alluded earlier to the role of Black women in the transformations of American society. And we have to spend a moment at least to talk about Gary Duncan's mother, who was in many ways the force that gave him the backbone. But I would also say that as a historian friend of mine taught me, the main reason or a main reason to study history is to put yourself in the position of those historical figures and ask yourself what you would have done and hopefully gain insight and wisdom and guidance for how you should go about it. So, you know, ask yourself what you would have done if you had been a German in the midst of the Holocaust, if you had been a Hutu in the midst of the Rwandan genocide, if you had been from the family of a Klans member in the context of the American South, or in Gary's case, given the fact that the police gave him a couple of opportunities to lie and pretend that he was guilty of something, and in so doing, to minimize the punishment, he made the decision to fight. If Nancy was doing stories about people who took the easy way out, it wouldn't be a trilogy. It would be what's the word for a millionaire or something.
Right.
So the point is that the question for each of us is, put in a similar circumstance, how would we have behaved? And that is the enduring lesson of all of these films for me.
Right. You know, I did a film that showed at this film festival a couple of years ago on Sidney Lumet, the director of many films that deal with morality and fairness. And we discovered in the research on this film, the interview that was done right before he died, that he had been party to a gang rape when he was in the army, when he was in India. And he had witnessed this, and he had never done anything. He didn't stand up to his fellow soldiers to try to stop it. And I think he was haunted by that his entire life. And so when we look back at his canon of work, what are the films that we remember? We remember the films that he made where he's uplifting people who stand up against corrupt forces, against crowds, even 12 Angry Men. There's one man that stands up against the jury who will not come to a righteous decision. So I don't want to get us too much off subject, but you know, if we witness things and we don't do something, in one way or another, it really is going to haunt us. And he was able to resolve it by making films about these subjects. But these are things that are going to live with us our whole lives as we witness them.
Yeah, I want to circle back. You raised that Richard Sobel was Jewish, and a lot of the lawyers who went down south were Jewish. And there was last year, the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival had a film about the relationship between Blacks and Jews in Atlanta and in the South. that coalition is not the same in this generation as it was in the past generation. It has become weakened. Any thoughts about that particular allyship between Blacks and Jews that you learned as a result of making this film, Nancy?
Well, I think Robert Collins says this pretty clearly in the film. He says that, you know, in the 60s, the Holocaust wasn't that far away. I mean, it's only, you know, 15-20 years ago. And so the pain and the tragedy of that is much fresher in people's minds than it is today. And so there are people that I think were inspired and motivated to help people. They felt this is something they felt they could do something about. You know, it was too late to change what happened in the Second World War during the Holocaust, but this is something they felt they might have an impact on. But as Lolis points out in the movie, and I thought this is a very important point to make, that even though Jews did feel, you know, strongly about doing this and felt good about the work they were doing, they had to be reminded, and probably weren't reminded as much as they should have been, that they could do things that Black people couldn't think about doing themselves. So it's a complicated question, right, Lolis?
Yeah, Lolis, I want you to address this one too.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on it. One thing to keep in mind is much of the civil rights legislation bans discrimination based on race, creed, or color. Well, for the most part, Black people are Protestant Christians. So creed was not a problem for us. And the question is, for whom was creed a potential problem? Why would it be included? Well, that, I think, therein lies some of the reasons for the allyship, some of the joint interest to be enjoyed. The other thing I would say is that we are now in a moment when Black people are far more empowered than they have been previously. And so this conversation can take place on something closer to equal footing. We still find ourselves with Black people having the numerical majority in terms of minorities able to move electorates and so forth, but Black people still having very little access to capital and very little money of our own. So how do we negotiate these things? And then when you put it in the international context, it becomes that much more complicated. You know, when Nelson Mandela was released, he made clear his debt to some of the Arab nations with whom Israel has not been getting along. Well, how do we maintain a sort of domestic tranquility when our international interests at times seem divergent? And to be honest, I am impatient, if not angered, by people who want to gloss over those things and talk about the glories of these past days, because if we were empowered to fight together against injustice and racism in the United States, we should not fail to use that same courage to at least ask ourselves what the legitimate grievances are on the part of each party and how those grievances can be addressed in a way that's as equitable and as fair as possible and reflects the society that we sought to build together back in the 60s.
Yeah, no, really good point. You know, with documentaries that tell powerful stories like this one of personal courage and that take on these moral human rights issues, calls to action. People are always wanting to know, okay, yeah, I'm motivated by this. What can I do? Do you have suggestions for people who get inspired by these stories, what it is they can or should do?
Oh, you know, there's so many different possibilities. There's so many not-for-profits. There's so many ways that one can step in and protest and make sure they elect the right people. Our vote is probably the most powerful tool we have. And thank goodness more people used it in this election than ever before. But I don't think we can relax. I don't think we can, just because we got this one man out of office. I think we have to be really careful before we take any of this for granted. I think we see how disruptive people like that can be, and we're not finished. I mean, he still plans to disrupt things, and you know, there may be violence in the streets still. So it troubles me that there's still so much to do, and I wish I had more concrete a concrete answer. Maybe Lois will, but I just feel like there's so many opportunities out there, and one has to do what is, whatever they're motivated to do, but they should not relax.
Yeah, I mean, just to add my 2 cents to that, I felt like the law was a huge winner. The idea of the rule of law, of playing by the rules, of having people who understand the law, who understand state law versus.
And that's what our film is about.
Yeah, I felt like the rule of law and understanding these foundational documents and the laws that they're based on, I was hoping that people would want to have a renewed understanding of these basic civic notions and civic responsibilities. Lois, I'll have you take a crack at what people could do as a result of seeing this story.
Well, one of my favorite poets, a man named Sekou Sundiata, wrote once that Americans are loving the past as long as it's not history. I think we have a mythologized view of our past and therefore a fictional view of our present. I would suggest that people study American history with the kind of clear eyes that Nancy brought to this in her other films and understand the extent to which these moments are not without precedent. The other thing that's been striking to me in the past several years is that having traveled a lot in Africa and in other parts of the world, we often talk about how we can't believe that these people allow themselves to be ruled by these dictators, allowed the principles of democracy to be thwarted so easily. Well, we have seen, even currently, with the reluctance of a large minority of our population to accept the results of a free and fair election, we see how very fragile this principle we all claim to hold so dear is. So I would suggest an understanding of our history is the first motivation for meaningful action of whatever ilk one chooses for one's personal expression.
Yeah, here, as the director of a history museum, that is music to my ears. I would just like to ask, next projects, current obsessions, what you both are doing now. Nancy, what is your next project?
Well, I'm so involved in getting this film out there. And believe it or not, we are still raising money to make sure that we can put together an impact campaign for it. So if anybody is interested in helping us do that, they should come to our website, augustafilms.com, where there's a donation button. So that's going to be my main focus for a while. I'm also taking one of my earlier films called Afternoon of a Fawn and kind of migrating that into a narrative version, which is what we did with The Loving Story. We made Loving. I'm doing the same thing with that. So I'm working on a script for that. So those are my two most important preoccupations right now. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, Lolis. Well, and this is all an excuse to ask you about the barbecuing. Barbecue, sorry. Okay. Barbecue is my favorite food. I moved from New York to Atlanta. I couldn't be happier getting to taste.
Yeah, there's some good barbecue there with Fox Brothers. And what's my man's name? His place burned down. He's opening it again. And Rodney Scott is going to open a barbecue place there soon. But my next project, I got a book coming out with barbecue man Rodney Scott in the spring. But I'm in the very early stages of a book about my mother. As you may recall, in the March on Washington, there were no women who spoke. Mm-hmm. And in Nancy's film, my mother is not mentioned. I don't think that's accidental. So I'm interested in the sort of anti-feminist bias of my father and by extension of the other men of that era and what lessons there are to be learned for men of my era. So that's my next project.
That's exciting.
Excellent. Yeah. So thank you both so much for this conversation. It's been terrific. This whole film series is about Together Through Film from the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. We're delighted that you all tuned in and joined us. Thanks again to Nancy and Lolis for your insights. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jill. Thank you.